This is CNN.
A deadly mistake in the Persian Gulf War. 2 British armored vehicles targeted by U.S. warplanes. 9 British soldiers are dead. Now the victims' parents demand answers.
We just want to know the truth. If they were British, they'd stand up and be counted. That's all we want the Americans to do. Come out and tell us the truth.
The question still haunting the victims' families: who's to blame? To our viewers from around the world, good evening from London. I'm Hilary Bowker.
And good afternoon from Washington. I'm Frank Sesno. We'll take a closer look at that friendly fire incident in the story with our military affairs correspondent, Wolf Blitzer. A British lawyer representing victims' families will join us. But first, here's a brief update on stories making international headlines. After months of behind-the-scenes internal debate and diplomatic arm-twisting, President Bush has announced he will go to Brazil next month to attend the United Nations-sponsored Earth Summit. The word came after an Oval Office meeting today with UN Secretary General Boutros-Ghali. At issue all along for the U.S. was the economic price for environmental protection.
I take great pride in the fact that in many ways the U.S. has been a leader for environmental matters. I'm convinced that we can have jobs and economic growth as well as sound economic environmental practice, and I will be taking the U.S. message to Rio to that end.
Last week, the U.S. prevailed in talks on global warming, persuading other countries to agree to a draft treaty that omits specific targets for reducing greenhouse gases. Well, nearly 2 weeks after the verdict in the Rodney King case, more arrests. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates says 3 men were arrested in connection with the beating of truck driver Reginald Denny. It became the very image of social breakdown. Denny, pictured here, pulled from his vehicle and savagely beaten shortly after the verdict was handed down. He has undergone reconstructive surgery on his face and remains in intensive care. He's listed in good condition. For what's left of Yugoslavia, there is a higher price to pay for ethnic fighting in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The European community ordered its observers out, saying it's just too dangerous to stay. Yesterday, the EC nations called home their ambassadors to Belgrade. Today, Washington followed suit. And the crew of the space shuttle Endeavour will try again tomorrow to snag a wayward satellite. The first 2 attempts have failed. The crew now wants ground controllers to let 3 astronauts spacewalk out and wrestle with it rather than 2.
Friendly fire. The term is one of those pleasant-sounding euphemisms used to cover up one of war's most tragic mistakes. One such fatal incident during the Persian Gulf War has the parents of British victims charging the United States with a cover-up. The incident claimed the lives of 9 British soldiers. An inquest into their deaths resumes tomorrow. CNN's military affairs correspondent Wolf Blitzer has this story.
It was the single worst friendly fire incident of the Gulf War. On February 26th, just as coalition forces were liberating Kuwait, 2 U.S. A-10s fired their Maverick missiles at what they thought were Iraqi tanks, but what turned out to be 2 British infantry fighting vehicles, seen here only moments before the attack. 9 British soldiers were killed. Since then, the 2 allies have disagreed over responsibility, and relatives of the dead soldiers seeking the truth have felt betrayed. Ann Leach's 20-year-old son Kevin was among those killed.
We feel that the British government don't want to upset the American government, and it doesn't matter about the little people on the ground.
The Pentagon, in this 25-page document just submitted to a coroner's inquiry in Oxford, England, insists that the 2 A-10 pilots acted in the good faith belief that they could attack in the area in which they were operating. The pilots, the document adds, received information from the British air controllers that there were no friendlies within 10 kilometers of the target area. British authorities insist their controllers had provided the pilots with other coordinates of the target area, but the pilots say they never got that radio message. The British also maintain that the vehicles were correctly marked. The pilots, whose identities are being kept secret, say they saw no friendly markings. They were flying at 8,000 feet. The British families want the pilots to appear in person to explain the discrepancies. They met with President Bush last September and say he promised to reopen the investigation.
If he's an honourable man, he's got to turn around and say to these pilots, I've told the British families they can have the truth, and the only way they're going to get the truth is by you going over there and telling them what happened.
The mother of another dead soldier confronted the U.S. ambassador in London, who defends the decision not to send over the pilots.
I think that there is likely to be, in some respects, a circus should these pilots now appear in any sort of a process.
Some U.S. officials suspect that the British families want the U.S. government to pay them reparations, but the U.S. Foreign Claims Act excludes payments for incidents arising directly or indirectly from combat. Hilary?
Wolf, I understand that the new British Defense Minister, Malcolm Rifkind, has just met with Secretary Cheney. Was there any news after that meeting?
Yes, Hilary. The Defense Minister, Malcolm Rifkind, emerged just moments ago from a meeting with the Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, and told reporters that he passed on a letter from the families to Mr. Cheney. But Mr. Rifkind stopped short of actually saying that the British government has asked the U.S. government to hand over the pilots. Even as Cheney and Rifkind were meeting, though, the Pentagon spokesman, Pete Williams, made clear that the U.S. would not do so.
First, knowing the pilots' identities doesn't add anything to the issue of determining the cause of death of the fallen British soldiers. It doesn't provide any new information. Secondly, publicly releasing the pilots' identities would breach our government promise to the pilots not to disclose their identities outside official channels.
We recognize that it's for the American authorities to come to a judgment on what is a difficult and sensitive issue. The letter which I passed to Mr. Cheney was a letter that I received from the relatives concerned. That is, I think, appropriate for him to see and to consider the points that they raise in that letter, and I've been happy to facilitate that.
Some U.S. officials are already saying that we may never know what exactly happened in this tragic incident. Hilary?
Thanks, Wolf. Stay with us. We'll be coming back to you in a moment. As I just said, we'll have more on that friendly fire incident, and we'll talk to the lawyer representing the families of the 9 British soldiers killed by U.S. fire. We're back for a different look at the so-called friendly fire inquest underway here in Britain. Joining us here in our London studio is Geoffrey Robertson, Queen's Counsel, the lawyer for the families of the 9 British soldiers killed in the Gulf. Geoffrey, the 2 U.S. pilots allegedly attacked their personnel carriers by mistake, and also rejoining us by satellite from the Pentagon is CNN's Wolf Blitzer. Mr. Robertson, first of all, cover-up is something we've heard. Do you believe there is a cover-up here?
Yes, but it's continued on both sides. The British have been very reluctant to allow the truth to come out. Now, at these inquest proceedings we're holding in the old city of Oxford at the moment, the British side of the truth is coming out. What we lack is the American side, and it's tragic that the Pentagon has refused to allow the pilots who know best why they pulled the trigger that cost 9 lives and 11 others seriously injured, the worst friendly fire incident in the Gulf, have not come to explain. I want to correct something that the Pentagon spokesman said. He's wrong. We don't want the pilots' names. We want their evidence. There are plenty of ways in which you can withhold their names and simply ask them some questions about this tragic incident with the hope that security measures can be put in place in future so that it will never happen again.
Now, you're saying, of course, then that something could be done so that you could have a kind of an anonymous...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're not used to that in America. We have it all the time in Britain with the IRA, informers and so on. We have people giving evidence behind curtains. We have ways of actually preventing the press from stating the names of witnesses. It happens quite often. It could happen in this case. We could even go to America and have a quiet video examination of the pilots at an airbase. There are many, many ways in which we can take this testimony. I'm not going to put these people in prison. I'm not threatening their lives. All I want to do is ask them some very polite British questions about how come there are so many discrepancies, what happened here, what happened there. And I think the pilots themselves have probably just realized that this matter has become now an international question between America and Britain. They may feel as human beings, gosh, they have to live with this too. They killed 9 of their comrades. They may feel as simple human beings the need to come to Britain to say to the families of the people whom they killed, gee, we're sorry, it happened like this. And I'm sure if they did that, that would cut the Gordian knot that the Pentagon presently faces, and I think it would clear the air enormously.
Wolf Blitzer at the Pentagon, do you believe that there would be any kind of response to this sort of request now?
Well, I asked that specific question to Pete Williams, the Pentagon spokesman, a couple hours ago, and his answer was that, A, they don't want to subject these pilots to these kinds of questions. They say if the pilots volunteered to come forward and to testify directly to any sort of British inquiry, they would not stand in the way of the pilots doing so, but they say they're not going to force the pilots to do so.
Now, Wolf, what about the discrepancies in the British testimonies, if you will, and in what the pilots have been said about specifically not getting the correct coordinates, that they didn't receive a message that was sent? I mean, how is the Pentagon explaining these discrepancies?
Well, the Pentagon provided this lengthy 25-page letter to the coroner's inquest in Oxford. I've read that lengthy statement. There's one area that perhaps could have clarified this to a certain degree, although I'm sure the families would never be satisfied, understandably so, given the tragic losses that they have, of course, had to suffer from. But there were some tapes, some videotapes, some audio tapes, let me correct that, that were standard in those A-10s in those planes. And unfortunately, right after the pilots returned from that friendly fire incident, those audio tapes, which the Air Force says they checked and contained nothing that could have shown that this was anything other than what the Pentagon says it was, those audio tapes were then thrown into a pile and reused as part of the continuing
Wolf, what they
war
said
effort.
Was that
and
they showed nothing of the sort. They showed nothing about the incident. And,
that's correct.
The tapes were wiped, so that doesn't really get us any further.
Right, well,
okay,
I was about to say, if those tapes had not been wiped, presumably that could have alleviated some of the concerns of the families.
Yeah, it would have done, but we don't have that evidence, and all we can do is ask for the pilots who may, as I say, as decent human beings, come forward and explain what has happened, because it's so important to families whose children have been killed in this as part of a great victory, to know that this sort of incident won't happen again, that steps will be taken, that their children will not have died in vain. I must make clear, too, that one thing that Wolf said is actually incorrect. These people have assured me that they are not interested in money. They do not want money from America. They simply want the truth. And as comrades in arms, I think they are entitled to that under circumstances where everyone is protected. The pilots aren't subjected to, they're not going to be lynched, they're not going to be pilloried. They have to tell their story in quiet and have to be examined so that lessons can be drawn from the future.